Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Coaching Accountability for Impact on People and Results, with Kent State Facilitator Deborah Easton. It is now time to start at exactly 10 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and pass the mic over to Deborah.
Okay. Good morning. Welcome to a tough subject. I know that's the last thing that you wanted to hear, but accountability is a tough subject, first of all, because most of us would really rather not have to deal with it. We would hope that people would do what they've promised and do what they have been instructed, but that's not always the case. And if you think about it, society as a whole is struggling with the issue of accountability pretty much ever since that woman went through McDonald's drive-thru, ordered the hot cup of coffee, put it between her knees, took the lid off, was burned by the liquid, and then sued McDonald's. I think most people have heard of that particular incident, but it was about that point in time when I began to notice that there were more and more questions and programs about holding people accountable. We seem to shift away from what do we need to do to why is it that we're not doing it. And so in our time together today, you will be finding that we are going to be talking about a couple of questions, typical questions that people ask about the coaching accountability issue. You know, if you say the word accountability to most people, they react like they're in a horror movie. They begin to hide because they're afraid it will mean more responsibility, or they go screaming off into the night because they feel that they will be blamed. And so as a result, these are the questions that we will be talking about in our time together today. First one is, how do I move a coaching conversation beyond continually talking about the problem? Perhaps you have a chronic complainer who just only will focus on the problem. Or maybe you have someone who spends the last half hour bringing you the problems of the day, wondering why you didn't fix them. Second question that we're going to take a look at is, what persuasive word choice can I use to respond to and remove excuses from the conversation? You know, early in my career, as I was teaching presentation skills, the number one fear of the American public, I heard an awful lot of excuses as to why people weren't present to offer their assigned presentation for that evening. Some of those excuses including their car got stuck in a rock in the middle of some street in the middle of Kent, Ohio, still haven't found that rock. Or my favorite of all time is the person who was too upset to speak because they had just had an out-of-body experience. Perhaps you have a list somewhere in your office of the interesting excuses that people have given you for avoiding accountability. So we'll take a look at how we can remove excuses from the conversation. Our third question has to do with, how do I prevent a coaching conversation from being perceived as a personal attack? Have you stopped coaching somebody because their defensive response causes you to question if you're being unreasonable? That is a methodology they're using to get you to back down. So we do need to make sure that the coaching conversation does not come across as a personal attack, and instead we have people focused on what it is they need to do. And then, of course, our fourth question, how do I avoid nagging or micromanaging in my follow-up to the coaching conversation? Is it possible that people have stopped thinking for themselves and taking initiative because they know you'll be there to tell them what to do anyway? These are the kinds of things that we need to think about in our time together this morning. And so as we go through, if any questions pop up, any examples that you have that are causing you to avoid the coaching situation, please type those in, let us know what those questions are, and we'll address them as we go through. So let's take a look then at the first question. How do I move a coaching conversation beyond continually talking about the problem? Well, you know what? Let's try an exercise to illustrate this point. It's a two-part exercise. So first thing I would like you to do is tell yourself a story about a situation at work that constantly causes you frustration. Maybe it's a person. Maybe it's a problem. Maybe it's a piece of equipment. Whatever it is, I'm going to give you a moment to think this through. Tell yourself a story about a situation at work that constantly causes you frustration. Okay, now once you have told that story, I'd like you to tell yourself that story all over again. But this time, tell it from the point of view of how you are contributing to the problem. Now, I paused there because usually there's silence when I make this recommendation. We have to really stop and think about it. Maybe you didn't start this situation, but is your reaction to it making it better? Is your coworker really just a jerk, or is there an issue that needs to be resolved? And how are you involved in that issue? Think about that for a moment. Okay, so now that you have the same situation but two different versions of the story, let me ask you, so which version of the story was more fun to tell? I'll bet it was the first one. It was a bit of a relief, a bit of a catharsis to get it all out there, your frustration. The second version of the story isn't quite as much fun because in the first version of the story, we're pointing our finger at other people. The second version of the story, we need to turn that finger back toward ourselves. What is my contribution to this situation? I mean, if you take a look at it from this point of view, look at story number one. Everything is happening to you. We go into what's known as a psychological victim mindset. Here's an example. You're on your way somewhere. You've left early to compensate for weather or traffic. And despite your best efforts, traffic comes to a complete and total halt. And our first reaction is to say, okay, who's the idiot up there that caused this problem? As if perhaps the highway department sat in a conference room a couple of weeks ago and planned on that very day how they would mess up our life. That's just not the way it is. But this is the focus in the first version of the story. We're focused on blame. Who is to blame for causing me these kinds of difficulties? Why is it that department never does what I need them to do when I need them to do it so that I can get my job done? Now, what can oftentimes happen with the blame is that it leads to a second problem, and that is scorekeeping. Who's winning on this? They are always disappointing me. I'm always doing for them what they ask when they ask it. And the problem with this is that once your entire team gets focused on blame and scorekeeping, look at that. Everyone is focused on the problem itself. And as a result, we're not doing anything about it. Well, that's not true. What we might be doing is actually undermining each other to even the score. And you can even hear this in the way in which people communicate. Once they get frustrated and are focused on the first version of the story, they will perhaps become sarcastic or passive-aggressive, making a comment to someone that is, well, the bottom line, hurtful. And when the person responds with, I don't appreciate that, what does the passive-aggressive person say? Hey, I was just kidding. Can't you take a joke? You're so sensitive. In other words, the person who made the inappropriate comment is not willing to take accountability for what they have said. Instead, they are blaming the victim of their verbal attack for their reaction. Now, the other problem here is this scorekeeping. Oh, we keep this score for years. So people get very focused on the past, all of the things that have happened to them for so long now. Well, the past. Is there any one of us who has absolutely no situation in the past that we wouldn't love to have a time machine and go back and have a do-over on that? But until Sheldon and Leonard invent their time machine, we're not going backwards. The only thing we have control over is the here and now and hopefully planning for the future. So you can see the first version of this story is all focused on the problem. And the longer we stay focused on this problem, the longer nothing changes as a result. So the second version of the story, look at what we're doing. We're controlling what we can control. Do I have control over how this other person, when they're upset, has a tantrum in the middle of a meeting? Well, I don't have control over that person's personality, but I certainly can have a coaching conversation with this person about the appropriateness of responding to an idea they hear in that meeting that they don't like. Think about what our focus is on sometimes. It's not the perfect solution. Sometimes it's coping mechanisms. Think about it. You have customers who make demands at the very last minute, or you think you know what they wanted and then they change their minds. Do we have control over what's driving the customer's requests at that moment? No, we really don't. But how well do we cope with that? Do we have people on our customer service staff who can provide that customer service with a smile, even though this is the sixth conversation of the day with the sixth customer making those last-minute demands? Those are coping mechanisms. And are people able to do that? The biggest focus in the second version of your story, noticed, was on action. Maybe you said to yourself, the action I'm going to take is to stop complaining about this situation over and over again. Or maybe you actually said to yourself, you know what? There's an actual solution to this situation. I need to step up and do something different, even if what I'm doing differently is my reaction to the situation. So this is what we mean by accountability. It's not blame. It's not more responsibility. The kinds of things that turn people into that horror movies, running off screaming into the night. It's trying to find what we can do about the problem. So therefore, when we come back to our first question, how do I move a coaching conversation beyond continually talking about the problem? Define accountability as action. It's action. What can I do right now? Think of situations where, let's supposing you are sitting in your break room right now, and someone came in, poured a cup of coffee, and as they left the break room and they walked out into the hallway, they spilled that cup of coffee. Maybe they didn't even notice that they spilled, so they didn't stop to clean it up. As you're sitting there in the break room, how many people do you think will walk down that hallway and tiptoe around that coffee spill and say, somebody ought to call somebody to clean that up? Now, you see, many people will say, I didn't start that problem, so why should I have to be the person who fixes it? Because if you are affected by a problem, you need to have impact on the solution. And that's why defining accountability as action is such an important theme when you are setting up a culture of accountability. Setting up that culture of accountability where everybody has this mindset. If I am affected by a problem, I need to be part of the solution. Well, that makes it a lot easier to coach one-on-one when the entire culture has that kind of mindset. Secondly, we should be encouraging people to tell the second story, that second version, at every opportunity. Yeah, we all have our moments when we go into that first version of the story, that emotional victim mode. The key is, how long do we stay there? And as a coach, how long do you allow people to stay there? What's the answer to that? I don't know. It depends on the situation. There are some situations that are serious enough that we need to spend considerable time in the first version of the story, exploring the problem, exploring the causes of that problem. We don't want to shut people down too quickly, or then they will walk away saying, management never listens to you around here. So what is the guideline on that? Well, the severity of the problem, how quickly we can move people from the first version of the story into the second. I think most importantly for all of us, however, is this point. Am I a model of accountability? What is my first reaction when I hear a problem? Do I react with negativity? I mean, is my first response to someone coming up with a new idea, we tried that once before, without even bothering to listen to how they may have improved that idea that we did try before? Maybe it's worth taking a second look at it. What about the phrase, think outside the box? Have you told people that? And then they spend 6 weeks coming up with a great outside of the box idea. They bring that outside of the box idea back to you, and what do you tell them? Well, we can't do that because of budget, manpower, time, customer restraints. You see what I just described there? A four-sided box. If there is a box, I need to have told them that before I ask them to think outside the box. In other words, they were motivated to come up with a great idea. They're in the second version of the story. They bring it back to me, and what do? I drag them into the first version of the story. And what about this? Are you devoting enough time in your meetings to generating solutions? Let's say you have the conference room for an hour, and you have told people we are getting together to solve a particular problem. Time it. How much time are you spending discussing the problem? The average? About 45 minutes. Then all of a sudden somebody says, whoa, we only have the conference room for 15 more minutes. Okay, let's start throwing ideas up on some flip chart sheets, figure out what we're going to do. And of course, then we run out of time to actually talk about how to implement any one of those great ideas. So we walk out of that meeting having sent a very strong symbolic message to people that we are more focused on the first version of the story. So this is why it's so important in moving our conversations beyond the problem, to look at ourselves, to look at the environment, to establish that we have defined accountability as action. Now let's take a look at question number 2. What persuasive word choice can I use to respond to and remove excuses from the conversation? Now, as we talk about this, I'd like you to think about some of the excuses people present to you. And if you have any questions about those excuses, please raise those questions as we go through this information. All right, so what is our first technique in removing excuses from the conversation? Well, it goes back to what we were just saying. Refuse to be stuck in the problem. For example, instead of accepting, well, I didn't know, ask the question, now that you do, what ideas do you have? Instead of just focusing on, well, why didn't you try to find out? That keeps us focused on cause of the problem. And I understand why you want to explore that. But the focus here is on getting to the solution. All right, now you do know. What ideas do you have? Okay, so now we'll follow that with a question like, and if a similar situation were to arise, what would you do differently? Let's take another common comment that people make. Nothing will ever change. Therefore, that's the excuse, nothing will ever change, so we can't do anything about it. Well, this is the point where we come back to that. Obviously, you are negatively impacted by this problem. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about this. So, what kinds of solutions do you have that would positively affect it? Maybe it can't make the whole thing go away, but what's an idea for coping with the situation? How about perhaps you've heard the excuse, this happens every time I get this job. Okay, an ongoing problem. Well, then let's talk about what you have tried in the past. What's worked out of that? What hasn't? Perhaps a combination of those solutions is what is the next step we should take to try to overcome this ongoing situation. Maybe it's an ongoing situation that isn't going to change and we can't do anything about it. It's January and it's Northeast Ohio and you wanted to ship something, but perhaps the weather is in your way. We can't do a darn thing about that. But what we can talk about is how we will cope with what we cannot change. That is an action plan. Perhaps you have heard, that's not my department. Okay, but you're in here telling me that you are affected by something that just happened. What solutions do you have that would make it better for you? Now, how do we talk to the department whose responsibility this is about those solutions? You see, what we're doing here is we're refusing to be stuck in the problem. All right, now let's take a look at another technique, getting blame out of the conversation. When we're focused on blame, well, people then start playing all kinds of games to cover their tracks, to cover their rear ends. And that takes us back to the who's to blame and how many times have I been blamed versus somebody else, that whole scorekeeping situation we were discussing. So look at this. Instead of saying, who did this? We should be asking what went wrong and how do we fix it? Think about a meeting you have been in where the person facilitating the meeting asks a question, so whose idea was this? Have you ever noticed what happens to the body language around the room? People are afraid of the blame, so the eye contact goes either down to the table or there are those meaningful glances toward the person whose idea it actually was. People are non-verbally throwing that person under the bus. But notice what happens when the meeting facilitator says, because I thought it was a great idea. Then all of a sudden, everybody's looking at the meeting facilitator, there are smiles on their faces, and they're claiming they had part of the solution, whether they did or not. The whole point to this is focusing on who went wrong causes people to stay in that first version of the story. Besides, at this moment, if something is going wrong, is who's to blame really the key issue? No, the key issue is we have a problem in front of us that needs fixing. Maybe not with a perfect solution at this moment, but with at least a quick recovery so that we can move forward and at a later date talk about what a more perfect solution might be. This question alone, who did this or who is involved, that focuses on the blame and the first version of the story. So this is two of the most important techniques we have for removing excuses from the conversation. I'm going to pause here for just a moment and give you an opportunity to contribute any of your questions or any of your situations or offer any of your examples of the kinds of excuses that people give you.
So just for the audience, if you could please type your questions into the question function on the right side of your screen, we will answer those as we have time.
Okay, well, be thinking about this, and I'm hoping that these two techniques alone help overcome a lot of the situations that you face. Right? If any of these questions come up, please continue to type them in. Go ahead, Greg.
Yes, we have one question that has come in that said, I can't control them, they don't report to me. How do I address that issue?
Okay, that is a very common question. And one of the difficulties that we have with that question is the word control itself. We have a tendency to believe that persuasion, influencing, coaching accountability is a matter of power over the other person. But influence happens regardless of power. Think about someone whom you admire. Why do you admire them? Because there are actions they take, and you've seen the positive impact of those actions. And so what do you do as a result? You try to emulate those same actions. That person has had influence on you without having power over you. So the question then becomes not, I don't have the performance review to hold over their heads because they're my colleague, not my direct report. The question then becomes, what actions can I influence? Perhaps by my own example of an accountable action. What can we talk about is an example we've seen other people do that is a better approach. How can I talk to this person about their current actions and the impact their current actions are having on themselves? You know, sometimes we're not aware of how we're contributing to our own problem. That's why that question in that early exercise, the second version is, how am I contributing to my own problem? Maybe my reaction to it is continuing the game playing. It's hard to face that, but that may be part of it. So, again, in answer to your question, we need to come back to influence, coaching, persuasion isn't about power. It's about putting an example of the accountable behavior we're looking for in front of that person. How do you react to the answer that I just gave?
Deb, we also have a similar question as I summarize. They're questioning, how do you approach a situation where a department's actions or inactions impact their own department, and how do they approach the other department, other manager to solve that problem?
Okay. I think we need to think about what all of the impacts of that situation are. You know, we have a tendency to get caught up in, this is what they do to us. Every time they delay getting us information, then here's what we have to turn around and say to the customer. Have we actually sat down with the other department and explained to them what the ramifications are for us, but most importantly, ask them why the delay occurs? I mean, maybe we ask for a volume of information every third Thursday of every month, and we have no idea that for that other department, the third Thursday of the month is the most chaotic day out of that 30-day period for those people in that department. Have we actually had that conversation? Have we asked the question, what can I do to make it easier or more effective for you to get me this information I need at this time frame? You know, we all get caught in our own tunnel vision, our own goals, our own deadlines, our own frustrations, and sometimes we fail to see that perhaps my own request, or even the way in which I ask it, maybe they're keeping score on how much my, well, for lack of a better term, rudeness has escalated over time because I've been keeping this score and I'm fed up with the fact that they haven't been giving me this information. It's very possible that this requires a conversation between all of the people affected. Remember that comment? If you are affected by a problem, you must be part of the solution. So who all is affected by this situation? We need to sit down and talk about other processes, other procedures, or at the very least, compare levels of understanding of the situation. Okay. All right. Those are very, very good questions, by the way, and they're very common situations that, as I look through our list of participants today, whether you are in healthcare or manufacturing or insurance or, a government agency of some sort, I think we all face that situation. Okay. All right. Well, let's take a look then at question number 3. How do I prevent a coaching conversation from being perceived as a personal attack? I think we have all had those types of conversations where people have responded to, well, you're asking me to completely change my personality. That's just the way I am. People are going to have to get used to me. No, it really isn't about you as a person. This is about choices of action that I need you to take. And the first step that we need to take there is one we don't think about, but that's this. Reinforce the balance between accountability for one's impact on results and accountability for one's impact on other people. It's actually the reason why I've titled both this webinar and the training program that I facilitate on this subject as Coaching Accountability for Impact on People and Results. Because people get this out of balance. And when people do not understand that we have an equal accountability for our impact on results as well as our accountability for impact on other people, well, it can be very difficult to coach them. For example, those of you who may be coaching a person who's in customer service. Have you ever run across someone who is absolutely stellar in the way in which they deal with customers? They're patient. They listen well. They paraphrase. They're conscious of their word choice, even though the customer's word choice may be highly inappropriate. But they exhibit every communication skill and choose every action you expect a customer service rep to perform. But as soon as the customer leaves the building or they hang up the phone or they are no longer emailing that person, the way they treat their colleagues is completely different. They walk in the morning and say, hey, this is going to be a 4-cup of coffee day. I've only had 2. Don't talk to me until I've had the 4th one. And you've had conversations with them, and they'll say, hey, that's just the way I am. You know what? No. You have just demonstrated in your treatment of customers that you can make other choices. But what you're showing to us is that you refuse to make those same choices with coworkers. See, oftentimes this results because we have a person who has overemphasized their impact on results. They know they're being graded by how well they treat customers. It almost, envision a person like this. They're focused on results. Sometimes I run into this, and forgive me, those of you who are in sales out there, but sometimes we run into this in this situation where we have a salesperson who makes all kinds of promises to the customer without thinking about whether manufacturing can actually make the product that quickly, whether shipping can get it out the door that quickly. And then, of course, the customer service department must deal with the disappointments that the customers are facing because an expectation was set by the sales department. Now, say you're going to sit down and you're going to coach this salesperson. Oftentimes their response will be, well, don't you want me to succeed? Well, we need to redefine for this person what we mean by success. Yes, we want you to meet your sales goals, but success in our organization also means that all of the people you have impact on, that's a positive impact that you're having. That's what success means. Now, that begs the question, are you only rewarding your salespeople for meeting their sales bonus? Or are you also rewarding them for how they interact with other people? That's an important consideration. Now let's look at the other side of it. Sometimes you deal with people who overemphasize their impact on people. They're people pleasers. The one that perhaps is spending the first hour they come into work socializing with everybody before they get down to business. And they will say to you, yeah, I want to create a good team atmosphere. Great, but can we do that in less than an hour? I mean, you understand the mindset there. Or perhaps they never say no to people because they want to be liked, and they overwhelm themselves. And impact on results means that details fall through the cracks. This is a person we need to sit down and redefine and say, listen, the inability to get all of this done is having a negative impact on people. I understand where you're coming from, but we can't focus so much on being liked that we're not focused on getting it done. So take a look at those two pictures. Do you have people who fall into those categories, whether they be male or female in either category? It doesn't really matter, but I'll bet you were picturing some folks as we were talking about that. This is the first place to start. Emphasize the equal importance between impact on people and impact on results. Then let's take a look at, in addition to this question, technique number 2. In the conversation itself, we need to talk about choices of action. All right, stop for a moment and think about someone in your life whom you absolutely love. Have you always loved every choice of action that person has made? Probably not. You just painted the living room wall. You're thrilled with the job that you did, but your 3-year-old got a hold of permanent markers and decided to add a mural to that wall. You love the 3-year-old, but you really hate the choice of action of adding the mural to that wall. We have a sense of detachment here with that 3-year-old. We say to them, please hand me the marker. Let me show you where you actually make your designs. See what you're doing there? You're coaching. You focused on the inappropriate action. You're offering an alternative action. Why don't we do that with adults? You know why? Because we say to ourselves, they should know better. They're adults, for crying out loud. Well, you know what? We can talk about all of the shoulds we want. They chose an action that wasn't what we were looking for. That's what the bottom line is here. So how we need to focus on this is to use word choice, and you can rearrange this how it sounds most natural to you. But you see the components of this statement. When this happens, you have drawn the mural on the wall. The impact is now we will need to repaint the wall because that's not what Mom and Dad were looking for, right? So now what's going to happen is you're not going to be able to play in the living room for another couple of days again because Mom and Daddy are going to have to repaint the wall. So let's talk about other options that we have for where you can put your artwork. Or in the case of adults, we ask the question, what ideas do you have? That's one of the mistakes we make in coaching accountability. We're always giving everybody the answer. That's enabling. You know the definition of enabling? Doing for somebody what they are capable of doing for themselves. The 3-year-old, not capable of finding the other option. An adult? Probably is. So think about these components. Here's what the choice was. Here's why that choice was inappropriate. And even taking it so far as to say the impact of that choice on the person who made the choice. Not just on other people, because quite frankly, you run into some people who could care less about other people. Now they say, well, that's their problem. But how does their own choice of behavior affect themselves? They may be creating their own worst nightmare. And this, if you think about it, this is the kind of word choice that is influential versus power-focused word choice. Now, you may have some people that are not influenced by this. We may have to back up against something like this. What the company requires is, what our team requires is And for those of you, especially in a supervisory role of whatever level, notice the word choice does not say, I need you to. And it doesn't say, I need you to, because then that becomes scorekeeping. People are saying, well, I did that for you. I did you this favor. This isn't about doing favors. This is about making a choice of action that is appropriate here on the job. Now, let me take that one step farther. That's not too difficult to do when you are talking about productivity, quality, and attendance. You have numbers to support that. But what if you're sitting down and talking to someone about the negative impact they are having on others? It is very, very important that we make it very clear what the company requires, what their job requires in terms of how they handle their stress, for example. This is not a conversation about their personality. This is a conversation about when you hear an idea in a meeting and that causes you stress because you have tried that idea before and it just did not work for you. And so what is your choice of behavior? You interrupt people. You speak more loudly than anyone else. You may use word choice that attacks the person for having the idea. Well, it figures you would come up with that harebrained idea. Those are choices of behavior. This is not about their personality. This is about choice of behavior. If they react that way in their personal lives, once they leave the company property, that's up to them. But on the job, as part of their job description, these are the choices of action that they need to take. And I'm going to pause here for just a moment again. That example in particular might bring to mind some folks or some actions on their part that you are finding difficult to coach. So what questions might you have about anything along those lines? Okay. Sometimes that takes a little bit of thought to let that sink in just a little bit. But go ahead and use that word choice you have there as a formula, and plug it in for several people you need to coach. Give yourself several different examples. Reword it. You can put it in any order you want to, as long as the components of that statement are there. Try it out. Practice it a little bit before you actually have the conversation. You will find that the word choice alone keeps us focused on the choice of action, not describing the person as chronically negative or too aggressive or any of those situations.
Deb, there was a question that's come in that asks, how would you address these kind of coaching situations differently based on the generations in the workplace?
Okay. Interesting question. First of all, the rewording of the statement that I have there on the slide in front of you. Our post-1980 generations, Gen Y, Millennials, Gen Z, are accustomed to hearing feedback and criticism, if you will, in a very positive way. So one of the things I would do for that generation is start with that last statement there in the first paragraph about what I'd like to do today is I'd like to talk about what ideas you have for other options in handling a particular situation. And then you go back to the beginning and you say, okay, when this choice is made, here's the impact that it's having on other people, and here's the impact I believe it's having on you. So I'd like to hear your ideas about what you would like to do differently. That would be one approach I would want to take with, like I said, the post-1980 generations. Now, a Gen Xer, born between 1965 and 1979, oftentimes very much an independent problem solver. So I may actually not need to say all of this with a Gen Xer. I might say, okay, I have observed this situation happen. Here's what I have observed the impact of that is. You tell me, how have you analyzed this situation? And I would turn it over to them very quickly. A baby boomer, on the other hand, we fabulous baby boomers, are storytellers, in case you couldn't tell by all the examples I've put in this today. And so for a baby boomer, as I approach this situation, I might not just ask them, what ideas do you have? But given where a baby boomer is in our tenure in our career, being a storyteller, we have a lot of examples of what we have seen. And I would ask for those examples. All right, here's a choice I'm seeing you make. Here's the impact I'm seeing that it has. What in your experience has led you to that choice? What choices do you want to avoid as a result of some of the experiences that you have had? So it's the same technique. It's just modified a bit based on what we know about those generations.
I have another question, Deb, that addresses how do you handle coaching an employee whose work is predictably great, but their attitude is all over the board from day to day, and you never know what you're going to get?
Okay. All right. So you never know what you're going to get. First of all, attitude is communicated through behavior. Let's say your person is upbeat one day. The next day, they walk in like Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh. 10 years ago, everything used to be more of a family atmosphere around here. Nobody ever listens to me. All right. I'm hoping several of you are chuckling, and many of you are probably visualizing someone who falls into this category. Okay, have you ever tried to have a conversation with this person about their outlook on life, trying to convince an Eeyore that the glass is actually half full as opposed to half empty? Yeah, you're going to need an army of Dr. Phils to make that happen. This isn't about their mindset, their attitude. It's about the choice of behavior. Let's say this person, God forbid, is in a customer service role. So one day they're upbeat and everything's positive with the customer. The next day they're talking to a customer and they're talking about everything wrong with the company and how it used to be better 10 years ago and can't believe they put this upgrade on the product because it was much better in version number 1 than version number 3. Those are choices of actions that are communicating that negative attitude. But those are the choices of actions that are not acceptable in that job description and in that situation. In other words, they can think any way they want to, but they need to make a different choice of how they act on that opinion. So we're asking for them, regardless of what their mood is that day or their mindset is that day, that these are still the choices they need to make. Now, if there is some kind of physical illness or something that is creating that problem, well, then we can have a conversation about, what do you need on those particular days? Your back is killing you. What do you need on those particular days to become more physically comfortable? Okay, we still need to make those choices because that is what the job requires, what the company requires. Okay. Hopefully that example alone addressed a lot of issues. Your aggressive people, your chronically negative people. We're telling them that the job requires that consistency of making those choices. And if the consistency isn't possible, we need to explore what we need to do about that. All right. So finally, we have question number 4. How do I avoid nagging or micromanaging in my follow-up to the coaching conversation? All right, this is hard because we want to see the action that we've coached them on. One of the problems there is that we have a tendency to believe in magical word choice. Look, I have a background in rhetoric. I wish I could tell you there are magical words that make everybody do what you want them to do. It just isn't the case. So waiting and hoping as a result of this conversation, it's not going to get you what you're looking for. Look at it this way. Stop and think about your own worst habit. How many persuasive conversations have you had with yourself about changing that habit? It's not until we put an actual action plan, complete with follow-up, in place that the habit changes. So therefore, our first step in avoiding nagging is we will state the timing of the follow-up at the end of the coaching conversation. Not just have the conversation and hope we see what it is we were asking for. No, what's the timing going to be? We will get back together once a week, once a month, in the next 10 minutes. What is the timing? And describe why you have chosen this timing. Maybe you have a situation where you're asking people to pay closer attention to detail on a task that they only do once a quarter. They're bound to forget half of what we talked about. Well, how can we give them some practice opportunities a little more often throughout the quarter, so that it becomes more of a habit for them instead of that unique situation they do once in a while? And what will the format be that the follow-up will occur? For some people, you're going to ask them to go off for a week or so and try it on their own. Others, the format might be, okay, tomorrow I'm going to spend some time with you, sitting with you, listening in when you're dealing with difficult customers, and giving you some suggestions. I'm not going to be sitting there with a checklist of everything you're doing wrong. No, we're going to sit there and talk about what other options and possibilities are available in those situations. All right, now take a look at the second technique, and that is using trust as your determination for whether they check back with you or whether you check in with them. All right, now here's what I mean by that. Those who have proven themselves to be self-sufficient set up a plan, a schedule of when they will check back with you. Okay, because they will go back out there and be like people who play video games. They're going to hit the reset button all on their own until they figure it out. Okay, you don't want to interrupt that process. They pride themselves on being independent problem solvers. You come along too often, even asking a positive question like, is there anything I can do to support you? In the back of their mind, their answer might be, yes, leave me alone. I'm trying to do this on my own. I pride myself on being able to do that. So ask them, what is the best schedule that would be best for you, for me to have you check back with me? All right? Now, for people who need to prove themselves, maybe they're new to the task, or maybe they're the type of individual who typically makes promises, but they don't follow through on those promises. All right? Now, this is one where you're going to check in with them, and you're going to put the schedule in place for this check in with them process, so that they know that this will be step by step. Someone asked earlier a question about generations. Many of the members of our younger generations, the teaching style for them has been step by step with a do-over after each step until the test becomes real. Therefore, this is a person who isn't going to resent your step-by-step check-in with them. They're going to be more comfortable with this step-by-step check-in with them. So again, it comes back to trust as that determination. You know they can handle this on their own. Ask them. When would be appropriate for them to check back with you? Those who still may need to prove themselves, figure out what that you're going to check in with them process is. And by the way, for those who have a tendency to make promises they don't keep, you might want to add a few surprise check-ins with them so that they're not just behaving themselves when they know you're coming around. So there you have it. We've had 4 typical questions that people ask about the coaching process, 4 dilemmas that we face. What other questions are out there that I have not yet addressed for you in our time together? Okay. All right. Well, this has been a lot of information. I'm hoping that there have been at least a couple of suggestions along the way that have been helpful to your situation. So let's take a look at what some of those are. First of all, remember, define accountability as action and focus on the second, solution, action-focused story. Think about how much better your work environment would be if people would take the accountability to say, all right, I need 5 minutes to vent, and then I'm going to give you 2 solutions for the situation I have in front of me. That would be a perfect world. Secondly, we need to remember to remove blame from that conversation. When people fear being wrong, being blamed, they're going to play a lot of different games, and tell a lot of different stories instead of focusing on what we need to do differently. Thirdly, remember, we talk about choices of action and the impact of these choices on themselves, on others, and on results. That's the main focus of your coaching conversation. And then lastly, establish specific timing for follow-up and do so consistently. If you don't establish this schedule, then you're going to keep yourself in the first version of the story, where we're always focused on the problem. We're still not seeing what we're looking for. Establish that follow-up. Remember, we need to follow up with ourselves to break our own worst habits.
All right, we have just a couple of minutes left. I have one more question I hope that you can address before we get into the wrap-up here. It says, what role do write-ups come in to this situation? At what point do you bring that into the equation?
Okay. There can be a difference between an informal write-up and a formal write-up. An informal one is you letting that person know, I'm taking notes on the fact that we have had this conversation so that I don't forget what we have said. And it's important that you let them know that you are doing that, but there's an important reason why you're doing that, because sometimes you run into a person who's very skilled at avoiding accountability. They do the right thing for 2 months, and then they revert right back to what they were doing before. And this time they have a new excuse, a new reason why they're doing that. And this type of individual can sometimes be a game player, and you feel like you're losing your mind. You're thinking, but didn't we have this conversation? They make you almost feel like you're the crazy one because they have reasons why they're doing this. So just even letting people know, I don't want to forget what we've talked about here and what I've promised to you. That's somewhat of the informal conversation. There's a point at which you may need to say, okay, we've had the informal. Now we need to make this very clear by the strategies that we talked about here that this is a part of their job description. I'm not just asking them to play nicely in the sandbox here. This is a part of their job description. And if that point doesn't seem to be made by the previous conversations, then a more formal process may be necessary. All right. Okay. I hope this has been helpful to you.
Thanks again, everyone. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us this morning and learn about coaching accountability. As you can see on your screen, we do have an upcoming program that Deb will be facilitating at the Kent State Regional Academic Center in Twinsburg. We'd love to have you join us or have one of your colleagues join us if you'd like to learn more. You can certainly call or email us for more information. and would also encourage you to mark your calendars for the next webinar, which will be on May 21st on motivating employees with Kent State facilitator Scott Tackett. If you haven't had an opportunity on the webinar panel on the right side of your screen, there are two handouts there. One is the schedule of upcoming webinars, and the other is a handout of an overview of today's content. So I encourage you to download those and use those. Once again, thanks for joining us. Hope you have a great day and a great weekend.